When we have a story in our head, we shape it and we share it. But just because we share it doesn't mean it goes anywhere. Some stories just fall flat on their feet. They get written, they get shared, but they don't travel anywhere, whilst others get picked up and they run around the world before a formal organisation has a chance to respond to them. Some stories are amplified and spread with great speed. We need to understand how this happens. What are the mechanisms of storytelling? What causes some stories to be amplified, some to be filtered out, some to fail, and some to become established wisdom, cherished stories? Well, think about something like relevance and timeliness. Sharing a story which is relevant to somebody is, of course, much better than sharing a story very widely to a large audience where it's just largely not relevant to any of them. So sometimes it's better to share a story to a small targeted group or just to one person to whom we know that it's relevant, rather than just broadcasting it. But of course, relevance isn't the only thing. It also needs to be timely. So there's no point in you sharing with me an example of how to fix something wrong with my car if there's nothing wrong with my car. But at the time when something's wrong with it, if you're the person with the expertise, if you're the person with the story to share, then it's both relevant and timely. Quite often I find we can use these notions of relevance and timeliness to help us to decide who we're going to share a story with and when we're going to do it. And sometimes, quite importantly, to decide not to tell a story at all. If, as social leaders, we just share stories widely but not wisely, then we're just adding noise into the system. And one of the things we should try to do is avoid adding noise into an already noisy system. But what about when we have shared that story? How is it that some stories are amplified and some just collapse? Well, it's quite a complicated area, really. Amplification isn't just a matter of volume. It's not the case that if we shout a story, it will travel very far. Nor is it really a feature just of quality. So if you record your story in a video or write it in this beautifully bound book, if you use a graphic designer to make it into a visual story, that doesn't mean that it will necessarily spread. You can have a beautiful story that can fail, and something really clumsy, handwritten, something which has terrible audio quality, but which has some other magical quality which is amplified very far. And quite often, the quality which it has is authenticity. The story is deemed to be really important. It has deep roots. And authenticity is interesting because authenticity isn't something that you broadcast with the story. It's something that's perceived or projected onto it by the recipient. So if you share a story with me, I'll be the one to decide if I believe you have authenticity as a storyteller. Let's think about this. If an organisation, say a pharmaceutical company, shares a story about a wonderful new drug that saved the life of a young child, and we see that child and we hear their story about how the drug alleviated their suffering, we may think, well, this organisation does good, this drug is good. But if we discover afterwards that they made the child up, that it's a fictional story, we may decide, well, that's really bad, I feel betrayed now. Or the other way round, if the reputation of that organisation isn't good, maybe they found a real child and got them to tell a real story, but we don't believe them because we don't believe that it has authenticity. So partly authenticity may be a factual thing. So if we meet someone online and they tell a story, but that's borne out by the evidence that we see around them, or if an organisation tells a story that we know is true because we know a wider context of the organisation, then that may work very effectively. But authenticity isn't something that can be guaranteed. And we can think about story filtering. So even if a story is authentic, it may be filtered out by a community that doesn't want to hear it. Because communities themselves, the tribes of the organisation, exhibit quite a lot of bias. We tend to hear stories that we want to hear. So if you want to get a story into that kind of community, perhaps a story of difference or a story of change, you'll have to think about, well, how can I make it relevant? And perhaps one of the things you'll have to do is open up a space for that community and that population to actively be invested in shaping that story. So in fact, you'll have to co-create it for it to travel beyond those known communities. Story filtering is something which is done by the communities around us. On the one hand, if we have an effective community around us, it will filter out the most important stories and it will amplify them so that we get to hear them. That's one thing communities do really well. But if we are trying to share a story and we don't take into account the mechanisms of filtering and amplification, it may only be shared within our own narrow bubble. It won't permeate through. In the notion of a socially dynamic organisation, we talk about interconnectivity. How will we connect stories between many different disparate communities and tribes? Because interconnectivity isn't something that will just be given to us. It's something which as social leaders we work hard to earn and we work in service of. Not just known stories told in known spaces where they're acceptable, but unknown stories which cross barriers, which open themselves up to difference, shared by, of course, us as social storytellers.